I think the economy is in horrible shape. If you look objectively at the data, the savings rate is at the lowest it's been since 2007. I think it's down to 2.3%. So Americans have blown through all their stimulus money, and now they're pretty much broke. If you look at credit card debt, it's at an all-time record high. So Americans are struggling to put food on the table and to pay the electric bill, and so they're borrowing more money on their credit cards. If you look at what's happening to wages, they are declining in real terms. And I think the real decline is being masked by the fact that we are understating inflation. I think the actual inflation rate is about double what the government will admit to. And that means that the real decline in wages is much greater, which explains why so many people are now moonlighting. A record number of Americans have 2 and 3 jobs. In fact, you have more Americans than ever that are working 2 full-time jobs. Most people don't want multiple jobs. They would prefer to be able to support themselves and their family on one job. But unfortunately, that's not possible. And that's where all these jobs that are being created are going. They're going to people who don't want more jobs, but who are forced to take them anyway, because that's the only way that they can keep up with the rising cost of living. And it's not a great economy where people who have jobs need to get a second job. They would rather have the leisure. They would rather be able to spend more time with their families. But unfortunately, they can't afford that. They have to go and get another job. If people come out of retirement, let's say somebody was retired, they're 70 years old, they were looking forward to just playing golf and going to the beach and hanging out with their grandkids, but now they have to go take a job at Target because that's the only way to pay the grocery bill. Do you want to brag about creating an economy where unemployed people are forced to go back into the workforce? The main reason that the unemployment rate is so low is so many people who aren't working are not counted as being unemployed. We have over 100 million working age Americans who are no longer in the labor market. You know, you don't count. If you've basically given up looking for a job because you don't think there's a job out there that you're qualified for at a wage that makes sense for you to take the job, after a year you don't count even in the U6 number, which is not the number that you just cited. If you look at the U6 number, which includes discouraged workers and people who are only working part-time but would prefer to work full-time and who are still looking for full-time employment but can't find it, there the unemployment rate, I think, is closer to 7%. But even that unemployment rate, once you've been discouraged for over a year, you're no longer counted in that number either. So I think if you objectively measured the unemployment rate and included all the people who are not working, but who would be working if they believe they can find a job, or who have settled for a part-time job when they'd prefer a full-time job, I'm sure the actual unemployment rate is in the double digits. The savings rate, again, is 2.3%. That's the most recent number that was released by the government. We haven't had savings that low since 2005. But one of the reasons that Americans weren't saving in 2005 is because they had so much home equity. They were just getting rich off the real estate. That was the peak of the real estate bubble. But right now, Americans are losing their home equity. Real estate prices are now falling. But what's more problematic is real wages are falling because the cost of living is going up and credit card debt has exploded. So if Americans really had all this savings, credit card debt wouldn't be skyrocketing. The reason credit card debt is going up so much is because people don't have savings. They can't afford to buy things. They have to borrow the money. But more of the money that they're borrowing is being spent on food. It's being spent on electricity, on gas. I mean, look at all the big retailers that are reporting that their customers are spending more money on food and less money on everything else because food is so expensive. You're looking at credit card rates now that are about 20%, and that is a huge amount of interest to pay. And I think a lot of people today have a lot more consumer debt than just their credit card debt, because over the last few years, a lot of these buy now, pay later companies have come into existence. And so people are using those companies to buy stuff without money, but it doesn't show up in the credit card numbers because it's not credit card debt. but it's still debt that the consumer is obligated to repay. And I don't believe they're going to be able to do it. You know, the credit card debt is non-secure. So if you don't pay it, the credit card company, you know, they can't come after your assets. They can't put a lien on your house or try to go after your IRA. So the debt is, you know, very difficult to collect if the person doesn't have any money. And it's also dischargeable in bankruptcy. So we haven't seen a big spike up in credit card delinquencies, but I think that's coming in 2023. And you know, what also happens with credit card debt is once somebody with credit card debt recognizes that they can't pay it back, and they've decided they're not going to pay it back, or that they're going to file for bankruptcy, what they will do before is max out their credit cards. They'll just borrow as much money as they can, because whatever they're buying, they're getting for free, right? So if you're planning on going bankrupt and you have $50,000 worth of credit card debt, but you still have another $50,000 that you can borrow, well, you're going to do it. You're going to go out and spend the other $50,000 and buy as much stuff as you can, because when you go bankrupt, you don't have to return that stuff. If you go out and you buy a bunch of clothes and some consumer electronics or take a vacation, and then you file for bankruptcy, you don't have to give any of that stuff back. And it makes sense that before you file for bankruptcy to buy as much as you can, because once you declare bankruptcy, you're not going to get any new credit cards for a while. So you get that moral hazard that's going to accelerate the losses for the banks that are issuing the credit. I think we're already in a recession, and the rate increases are partially responsible for that recession. I think the recession is going to get a lot worse. Now, that doesn't mean the Fed shouldn't be raising rates. They should be. They should already have raised them a lot more than they have. The problem was they never should have cut them. That was the mistake. It was cutting rates. Raising them back up is really just an acknowledgement of that mistake. But what happens is when the Fed raises rates, it uncovers all of the problems that it created when it reduced rates. Because when it slashed interest rates to zero, it inflated a bubble economy. And it inflated it with inflation. Quantitative easing was inflation. It's just another word to describe inflation. It's just that a lot of people don't realize that it is inflation, because inflation has a bad connotation to it. And so quantitative easing doesn't sound as bad. If the Fed said our policy is to create inflation, the public would have said, wait a minute, I don't want inflation. So if they say, well, our policy is quantitative easing, then you don't have as many people critical of the policy. But we're now experiencing the consequences of that inflation, rising prices, and prices still have a long way to go. And that's one of the reasons I think that the recession is going to get a lot worse, because more consumer income is going to be diverted to necessities like food, energy, rent, insurance, things like that. And interest rates are going to have to keep rising. And that's also going to take a lot of purchasing power out of the economy, because people have to service their debt. And if you're spending money paying interest on the money you borrowed to buy stuff in the past, you have less money left over to buy stuff in the present and in the future. And that's what helps bring about a more severe recession.